Meet Elizabeth, a kind-hearted woman who believed in love and loyalty. She dreamed of a happy life with her husband Robert, but everything changed when she discovered the shocking truth behind their marriage on their wedding day. For 10 long years, Elizabeth endured manipulation and betrayal, only to rise stronger than ever, reclaiming her identity and confronting her oppressor. Stay tuned, because you won't believe how this story unfolds. But if it's your first time here, kindly subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our next upload. Now let's dive into the full story. The ballroom shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off the gilded walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the breathtaking view of a sprawling vineyard. This was the setting for the wedding of Elizabeth, the cherished daughter of a prominent billionaire, and Robert, a suave, charming businessman whose name was whispered among the elite. To the hundreds of elegantly dressed guests, it was the perfect union of wealth and power, a fairy tale come to life. Elizabeth stood at the grand staircase in a custom-designed gown encrusted with pearls, her diamond tiara catching the light. Her delicate features were framed by soft blonde curls, and her emerald eyes scanned the crowd with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Her father had spared no expense for this occasion, wanting the world to know that his only daughter was embarking on a marriage that promised not just love but prestige. As Elizabeth descended the staircase, Robert waited at the bottom, dressed in an impeccably tailored tuxedo. His dark hair was slicked back, and his piercing blue eyes carried the intensity of a man used to getting what he wanted. His smile was dazzling, but there was something in his gaze, a fleeting shadow that Elizabeth couldn't quite decipher. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly. The vows were exchanged, the rings slipped onto fingers, and the kiss sealed their union. The applause was thunderous, and Elizabeth felt her heart swell with hope. As the couple exited the grand hall to a cascade of rose petals, Elizabeth whispered to herself, "This is the beginning of my happily ever after." But fate had other plans. The reception was a spectacle of opulence. A live orchestra played softly in the background as waiters in crisp uniforms moved among the guests, serving champagne in fluted glasses. Elizabeth, radiant and smiling, moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations. Robert, ever the charming host, stayed by her side, introducing her to influential figures who held the power to shape their future. Then the first crack appeared. Elizabeth caught sight of Robert standing in the corner, speaking to a striking brunette in a red gown. Their exchange seemed overly familiar, with Robert leaning in closer than necessary and the woman laughing softly. Elizabeth's smile faltered, but she quickly brushed aside her unease. "It's just a conversation," she thought. But the seed of doubt was planted. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The warmth she'd felt during the ceremony was replaced by a chill that seeped into her bones. When she finally had a moment alone with Robert, she asked about the woman in red. "Oh, her," Robert replied, his tone casual. "That's just an old friend. Don't overthink it." His words were reassuring, but his body language was not. He avoided her gaze, and his hand twitched slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks. Elizabeth decided to let it go, unwilling to mar the joy of their wedding day. But as the night ended and the guests departed, she couldn't shake the feeling that her fairy tale might not be as perfect as it seemed. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth settled into her new life with Robert in a sprawling estate nestled in the hills. The mansion was a testament to luxury, with marble floors, gold-accented furniture, and an infinity pool that overlooked the city skyline. Elizabeth filled her days with charity work and designing their home, while Robert busied himself with business ventures that seemed to demand more and more of his time. It was during one of these long days alone that Elizabeth found a letter tucked into Robert's study. The envelope bore the initials CM, and the contents made her stomach drop. The letter was from a woman who wrote with familiarity and passion, speaking of secret meetings and unfulfilled promises. Elizabeth's hands shook as she folded the letter and placed it back in its hiding spot. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, what did it mean for her marriage? But she decided to remain silent, unwilling to confront Robert without more evidence. Instead, she resolved to uncover the truth, even if it meant unraveling the life she had so carefully built. The following week, Elizabeth attended a high-profile charity gala hosted by her family. It was her first public appearance as Mrs. Robert Sinclair, and the media buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed as she arrived in a sleek black gown, her hand resting on Robert's arm. To the world, they were the picture of glamour and unity. But beneath the surface, Elizabeth's mind was in turmoil. The letter she had discovered haunted her, and every interaction with Robert felt like a calculated move in a chess game she hadn't agreed to play. She observed him closely throughout the evening, noting how his smile faltered slightly when their eyes met and how he seemed to avoid introducing her to certain people. It wasn't until later in the evening that Elizabeth spotted her again, the woman in red. This time, she wore an emerald dress that matched Elizabeth's eyes, a detail that didn't go unnoticed. Elizabeth watched as the woman approached Robert, her hand brushing his arm in a way that made Elizabeth's stomach churn. Elizabeth excused herself from a conversation and moved closer, positioning herself within earshot. The woman's voice was low and sultry, and Elizabeth caught snippets of their conversation. Mentions of unfinished business and when will you tell her? Her chest tightened, and a wave of anger surged through her. Elizabeth approached them, her voice steady but laced with steel. Am I interrupting something? The woman turned, her expression a mix of surprise and defiance. Robert, on the other hand, looked cornered, his usual confidence replaced by a flicker of panic. Elizabeth, he began, but she held up a hand. I think introductions are in order, Elizabeth said, her tone icy. She locked eyes with the woman, daring her to speak. I'm Clara, the woman replied smoothly, extending a hand. An old friend of Robert's. Elizabeth ignored the hand and turned to Robert. An old friend, is she? Robert stammered, but before he could answer, Clara spoke again. We were just catching up. Nothing to worry about. Elizabeth forced a smile, her mind racing. She knew there was more to the story, and she was determined to uncover it. But for now, she played the part of the gracious wife, biding her time. As the night ended, Elizabeth made a silent vow to herself. She would not be the naive bride who turned a blind eye to betrayal. If there were secrets lurking in the shadows of her marriage, she would drag them into the light, no matter the cost. Elizabeth woke the next morning in her luxurious master suite, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The opulence of her surroundings, the silk sheets, the hand-carved furniture, and the panoramic view of the city, was in stark contrast to the unease brewing inside her. The events of the gala replayed in her mind, each detail sharpening her resolve to uncover the truth about her husband's mysterious relationship with Clara. After dressing in a tailored white jumpsuit that reflected her poised exterior, Elizabeth descended the grand staircase to find Robert seated in the sunlit dining room. The table was laden with an extravagant breakfast spread of fresh pastries, exotic fruits, and steaming coffee. To any onlooker, they would appear to be a picture-perfect couple, enjoying the spoils of their affluent life. But Elizabeth could see through the facade. "Good morning, darling," Robert said, his voice warm but with an edge of forced cheerfulness. He gestured for her to join him. Elizabeth sat across from him, her face a mask of calm. "Good morning," she replied, her tone light yet probing. "Last night was eventful, don't you think?" Robert hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. It was a successful event. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. Everyone. Elizabeth pressed, her eyes locking onto his. Including Clara. Robert's fork clattered against his plate. He recovered quickly, offering a disarming smile. "Clara. She's just an old acquaintance. I didn't realize her presence would bother you." "It doesn't bother me," Elizabeth said smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "But I do find it curious that she seemed to know you so well. Almost intimately." Robert's expression hardened for a moment before he forced a laugh. "You're imagining things, Elizabeth. Clara and I go way back, but it's nothing to concern yourself with. Elizabeth's lips curved into a polite smile, but her mind was racing. Robert was a skilled liar, but she had learned to read the subtle tells in his demeanor, the tightening of his jaw, the way he avoided meeting her gaze. She decided to change tactics, allowing the conversation to drift to mundane topics, all the while planning her next move. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth retreated to her private study, a space decorated in soft pastels and adorned with shelves of leather-bound books. She opened her laptop and began researching Clara, determined to piece together the truth. It didn't take long to find her. Clara Mitchell was a socialite with a history of high-profile relationships and a penchant for stirring up drama. Several articles mentioned her name alongside Robert's in events dating back years, long before Elizabeth had entered the picture. The connections were undeniable. Her heart sank as she came across a photo of Robert and Clara at a charity gala from 3 years ago. The way they looked at each other spoke volumes, a familiarity and warmth that Elizabeth had rarely seen from her husband. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her mind swirling with questions. Was Clara simply a ghost from Robert's past, or was she still a part of his life? And if so, to what extent? That evening, Elizabeth decided to take a more direct approach. As Robert prepared for bed, she stood in the doorway of their vast marble-lined bathroom. He was tying the belt of his robe when she said, "Robert, can we talk?" He turned to face her, his expression wary. "Course. What's on your mind?" Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice steady. "Clara, I need you to be honest with me. Who is she to you?" Robert sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I already told you, she's just an old friend." "You're overthinking this, Elizabeth." "Am I?" she countered, crossing her arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like there's more to the story than you're letting on." Robert's eyes narrowed. "I don't appreciate being accused of something I haven't done. And I don't appreciate being lied to," Elizabeth shot back. "I saw the way she looked at you. I've read about your history. If there's nothing to hide, why are you so defensive?" For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. Then Robert's demeanor shifted. He stepped closer, his tone softer but still edged with condescension. "Elizabeth, I understand that you're feeling insecure, but you have nothing to worry about. Clara is part of my past, not my present. I married you because I love you, not her." His words were persuasive, but Elizabeth wasn't convinced. She nodded slowly, allowing the conversation to end, but inside, her determination solidified. Robert's evasiveness only confirmed her suspicions. As the days passed, Elizabeth began to dig deeper. She hired a private investigator, someone discreet who could uncover the truth without attracting attention. While she waited for results, she kept up appearances, attending social events and playing the role of the dutiful wife. But behind the scenes, Elizabeth was quietly gathering her strength. She knew that confronting the truth would come at a cost, but she was prepared to face it head-on. Her life in the mansion, with its glittering chandeliers and manicured gardens, began to feel like a gilded cage. The luxury that once brought her comfort now felt suffocating, a reminder of the secrets lurking beneath the surface of her marriage. One evening, as Elizabeth stood on the balcony overlooking the estate, she made a promise to herself. No matter what the investigation uncovered, she would no longer allow herself to be a passive player in her own life. She would take control, even if it meant tearing down the world she and Robert had built together. The stage was set for a reckoning, and Elizabeth was ready to face whatever came next. The morning light streamed through the massive windows of the master suite, illuminating the room's opulence, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Elizabeth's heart. She rose early, her mind set on reclaiming her dignity and power. Today was not the day for tears or weakness. Today was the day to act. Elizabeth descended the grand staircase with an air of quiet determination. She had spent the night reflecting on the conversation with Robert and what it revealed about their life together. The betrayal had opened her eyes to truths she could no longer ignore. Her marriage, built on years of sacrifice and compromise, had become a gilded cage, and Robert had become her captor. After breakfast, Elizabeth called her most trusted confidant, Eleanor, a sharp-witted attorney and an old college friend. Eleanor had always been the one Elizabeth turned to in moments of crisis, and this was no exception. "Eleanor," Elizabeth said over the phone, her voice calm but resolute, "I need your help. It's time for me to take control of my life, and I need to know my options." Within hours, Eleanor was seated in Elizabeth's private study. The two women, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books and antique decor, discussed the situation in detail. Legally, Eleanor began, scanning the prenuptial agreement. "You're in a strong position. The estate, the businesses, even his personal assets. Robert stands to lose significantly if this goes public. He'll do everything he can to avoid a scandal." Elizabeth nodded, taking it all in. "I don't just want a divorce, Eleanor. I want to send a message. He humiliated me, and he doesn't get to walk away unscathed." Eleanor's lips curled into a sly smile. "Then we need to play this smart. We'll use his fear of exposure to negotiate the terms in your favor. But first we need leverage." Elizabeth thought for a moment. "I already have proof of his affair with Clara. But there's more, his business dealings. He's always been secretive about them. If there's something shady, we can use it." "I'll dig into it," Eleanor promised. "But Elizabeth, are you ready for the fallout? This won't be easy." Elizabeth's gaze hardened. "I'm ready. I've been living in his shadow for too long. It's time I stepped into the light." Later that afternoon, Elizabeth found herself walking through the garden, a sprawling masterpiece of manicured hedges and vibrant flowers. It had always been her sanctuary, a place to think and regain her composure. As she strolled, her thoughts drifted to Oliver, her son. She had shielded him from the tension in the house, ensuring that he remained blissfully unaware of the cracks in their family. But as she watched him play with his tutor by the fountain, a pang of guilt pierced her heart. "Mommy," Oliver called, waving enthusiastically. Elizabeth smiled, walking over to him. She knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Hello, darling. Are you having fun?" "Yes," he beamed. "Mr. Carter says I'm doing really well in math." "That's wonderful, my love," Elizabeth said, kissing his forehead. "You make me so proud." As Oliver ran off to continue his lesson, Elizabeth's resolve deepened. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her son's future. She would not let Robert's betrayal define the life they had built together. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elizabeth hosted a dinner party. It was a last-minute affair, but the guest list included some of the city's most influential figures. Robert, unaware of Elizabeth's plans, was caught off guard when he arrived home to find their estate bustling with activity. "What's all this?" he asked, pulling Elizabeth aside. "A celebration," she replied smoothly. "I thought it was time to remind everyone of the power couple we are." Robert's eyes narrowed, but he forced a smile. "You could have told me." "Consider it a surprise," Elizabeth said, her tone dripping with subtle defiance. Throughout the evening, Elizabeth played her part perfectly, charming the guests and ensuring the focus remained on her. Robert, meanwhile, seemed ill at ease, sensing the shift in dynamics but unable to confront it in such a public setting. As the night wore on, Elizabeth caught Robert exchanging whispered words with Clara, who had somehow found her way onto the guest list. The sight stirred a mix of anger and satisfaction within her. Let him dig his own grave, she thought. By the time the guests departed, Elizabeth felt more empowered than she had in years. She had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life, and she was ready for whatever came next. As she stood in the quiet of the foyer, watching the last car pull away, Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. "This won't be easy." Elizabeth smiled to herself. Easy was never part of the plan. Elizabeth awoke to the soft hum of the automated curtains pulling back, revealing the breathtaking view of the city skyline. The towering glass buildings glinted under the morning sun, a stark reminder of the world she and Robert had built together. But today, the beauty felt hollow, a veil over the brewing storm that threatened to dismantle her carefully constructed life. She sipped her coffee slowly, her thoughts fixated on the events of the previous night. The dinner party had been a tactical move, a way to assert her presence and reclaim her image in their social circle. Yet, the moment she saw Robert with Clara in the corner, whispering like guilty conspirators, the sting of betrayal returned, sharper than ever. Elizabeth glanced at the clock. Eleanor would arrive shortly, bringing updates on her investigation into Robert's business dealings. Elizabeth's mind raced with possibilities. She needed more than just proof of his affair. She needed something that would ensure her victory, no matter how ugly the battle became. An hour later, Eleanor arrived, her sleek black briefcase in hand. She exuded confidence, her tailored suit and sharp heels echoing the aura of a woman who thrived in the courtroom. "I found something," Eleanor said without preamble, taking a seat across from Elizabeth in the private study. "It's not definitive yet, but it's promising." Elizabeth leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" Eleanor opened her briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents. Robert's company has been funneling money through offshore accounts. On the surface, everything looks legitimate, but when you dig deeper, there are irregularities. He's either hiding assets or engaging in tax evasion. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "And you can prove this?" "Not yet," Eleanor admitted. "But I've hired a forensic accountant to dig further. If we can tie this to Robert directly, it'll give us significant leverage." "He won't risk this going public." Elizabeth nodded, her mind already strategizing. "Good. Keep me updated. I want to know the moment you have something concrete." Eleanor hesitated, her gaze softening. "Elizabeth, this won't just ruin Robert. It could impact you too. You're his wife, and by association you could be implicated." "I don't care," Elizabeth said firmly. "I've spent years sacrificing my happiness for him. If this is what it takes to break free, so be it." As the investigation progressed, Elizabeth began to notice subtle changes in Robert's behavior. He was more cautious, his phone calls whispered behind closed doors. He spent longer hours at the office, and when he was home, he avoided her gaze. One evening, Elizabeth found herself alone in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns casting a serene light over the manicured landscape. She sat on the edge of the fountain, lost in thought, when a familiar voice broke her reverie. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Elizabeth turned to see Eleanor standing behind her, a rare look of concern on her face. "I thought you'd gone home," Elizabeth said, surprised. "I wanted to talk to you," Eleanor said, taking a seat beside her. "There's something you need to know." Elizabeth's heart sank. "What is it?" Eleanor hesitated, then said, "Robert knows we're investigating him. He started moving assets, trying to cover his tracks." Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. "How did he find out?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "But this complicates things. If he's already shifting funds, it'll be harder to pin anything on him." Elizabeth stared at the rippling water in the fountain, her mind racing. "Then we need to act quickly. I won't let him get away with this." Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder. "Elizabeth, I need you to be careful. Robert's not just a cheating husband. He's a powerful man with a lot to lose. If he feels cornered, there's no telling what he might do." The warning lingered in Elizabeth's mind long after Eleanor left. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that every move she made was under scrutiny. The next day, her suspicions were confirmed. As she walked through the marble-floored hallway, she noticed a figure lurking near the entrance, a man in a dark suit, pretending to examine a painting. Elizabeth approached him, her voice sharp. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" The man hesitated before producing a business card. "I'm with Harlan Security. Your husband hired us to enhance the estate's security." Elizabeth took the card, her expression unreadable. "Interesting. I wasn't informed." The man nodded curtly and walked away, leaving Elizabeth with a gnawing sense of unease. Robert was watching her, and she had no doubt it was his way of asserting control. But Elizabeth refused to be intimidated. If Robert thought surveillance would break her resolve, he underestimated her. The stakes were higher than ever, and Elizabeth was determined to win. By the end of the week, the luxurious estate that had once been her sanctuary felt more like a battlefield. Every interaction with Robert was laced with tension. Every corner of the house seemed to hold secrets. But Elizabeth was no longer the woman who cowered under her husband's dominance. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Elizabeth paced the length of her lavish study, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The opulent room, adorned with gilded chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, felt stifling. Eleanor's revelation that Robert was shifting assets had escalated her fears. The luxurious environment she had once cherished now seemed like a golden prison. Seated behind the mahogany desk, Eleanor shuffled through the latest documents she had retrieved. Her face was lined with concern, and the tension in the room was palpable. Elizabeth poured herself a glass of wine, her hand trembling slightly. "What do we have?" Elizabeth asked, her voice taut. Eleanor looked up. "It's worse than we thought. Robert's not just moving money. He's setting up dummy corporations overseas. He's planning to liquidate assets, leaving you with nothing." Elizabeth set the glass down with a sharp thud, anger flaring in her chest. "That bastard. He thinks he can erase everything I've built alongside him." Eleanor nodded grimly. "He's playing dirty, Elizabeth. If we don't act fast, he'll drain every account before we can stop him." Elizabeth leaned against the desk, her mind racing. What about Oliver? He wouldn't jeopardize his son's inheritance, would he? Eleanor sighed. "It's hard to say. Men like Robert see their wealth as a tool for control, not legacy. He's always been strategic about Oliver, using him to maintain his image. But if cornered, he might not hesitate." Elizabeth clenched her fists, a surge of protectiveness washing over her. Oliver was her anchor, the one thing Robert hadn't tainted. She couldn't let him become collateral damage in this war. Later that evening, Elizabeth attended a charity gala hosted at one of the city's most exclusive venues. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of opulence, with crystal chandeliers casting shimmering light over the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. She had debated skipping the event but decided against it. Public appearances were part of the game. As she descended the marble staircase into the ballroom, heads turned. Elizabeth exuded grace in an emerald gown that hugged her figure, her diamond earrings catching the light. She spotted Robert across the room, his arm draped casually around Clara. They looked like the picture-perfect couple, their smiles hiding the cracks beneath the surface. Elizabeth's lips curled into a bitter smile. If only the world knew the truth. Midway through the evening, Elizabeth approached the open bar. She ordered a martini, her eyes scanning the room. As she sipped her drink, a familiar voice broke through the ambient chatter. "Elizabeth." Looking radiant as always. She turned to see Julian Hart, a real estate mogul and longtime family acquaintance. He was charming and enigmatic, with an air of confidence that matched her own. "Julian," she said smoothly, "it's been too long." "Indeed. How's Robert?" Still pretending to be the city's golden boy. Elizabeth smirked, appreciating Julian's candor. "You could say that." Julian leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You know, I've heard whispers about him. Something about offshore dealings. Are you holding up okay?" Elizabeth's gaze sharpened. "What have you heard?" Julian hesitated, then said, "Nothing concrete. Just rumors that he's consolidating assets for a big move. If you need help, I have contacts who specialize in leveling the playing field." Her pulse quickened. Julian's offer was tempting, but accepting help from him would come with its own risks. "I'll keep that in mind," she said coolly, masking her inner turmoil. As the night wore on, Elizabeth kept a close watch on Robert. She noticed the way he subtly excused himself from conversations to check his phone, the brief exchanges he had with men in dark suits who didn't mingle with the crowd. He was plotting something, and she was determined to find out what. Back at the estate, Elizabeth sat in her private lounge, a sprawling space with plush velvet furniture and panoramic windows overlooking the city. She replayed the evening in her mind, analyzing every detail. Julian's words lingered. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Eleanor entered, holding a thin file. "I found something you'll want to see," she said, handing Elizabeth the file. Elizabeth opened it, her heart sinking as she scanned the contents. It was a list of properties Robert had recently acquired. Luxury apartments in Dubai, villas in the Maldives, and a sprawling estate in Switzerland. "He's preparing to flee," Eleanor said grimly. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Not without a fight. The following morning, Elizabeth called for a family meeting. She knew the only way to dismantle Robert's plans was to expose his lies to those closest to him, especially his grandfather, James Worthington, a patriarch who commanded respect and wielded influence over the family fortune. As the Worthington clan gathered in the estate's grand dining hall, Elizabeth prepared herself for the confrontation. This was her moment to strike, to unmask Robert in front of the people who mattered most. The grand dining hall of the Worthington estate was a masterpiece of architectural brilliance. Its high ceilings bore intricate frescoes, and the crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the polished oak table that stretched the length of the room. The family gathered in varying states of curiosity and tension. Elizabeth sat at the far end, her emerald green dress a stark contrast to the dark wood. To her left, Oliver fidgeted nervously, while James Worthington, the family patriarch, occupied the seat of power at the head of the table. Robert entered last, his expression composed but his eyes flashing with suspicion. His confident stride faltered slightly when he noticed Elizabeth's calm demeanor. Clara was conspicuously absent, which further fueled his unease. He greeted everyone with practiced charm, but Elizabeth could see the thin veneer cracking. James Worthington cleared his throat, his deep voice commanding silence. "Elizabeth, you called for this meeting. It's not often the family convenes on such short notice. Care to explain?" Elizabeth rose gracefully, her movements deliberate as she placed a stack of papers on the table. "I appreciate everyone's presence today. I've uncovered information that affects not just me but the entire Worthington legacy." Robert leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "This should be good." Elizabeth ignored him, addressing the room. "For years I've endured Robert's deceit and manipulation, but recent discoveries have revealed the extent of his betrayal. He's been shifting assets, creating dummy corporations, and planning to flee with the family's wealth." Gasps rippled through the room. James's stern expression darkened, his piercing gaze fixed on Robert. "Is this true?" Robert scoffed, attempting to regain control. "Father, this is ridiculous. Elizabeth's clearly overreacting." "Am I?" Elizabeth cut him off, her voice sharp. She gestured for Eleanor, who stepped forward and distributed copies of the documents to the family members. "These records show the properties he's purchased abroad and the accounts he's drained. He's not just betraying me. He's betraying all of you." As the family pored over the evidence, murmurs of disbelief filled the room. Robert's earlier confidence began to crumble. He leaned forward, his voice low but venomous. "Where did you get this?" Elizabeth met his gaze, unflinching. "It doesn't matter how I got it. What matters is the truth." James slammed his fist on the table, silencing the room. "Enough." His voice carried the weight of authority that no one dared challenge. He turned to Robert, his face etched with disappointment. "I entrusted you with the family's legacy, and this is how you repay me." "Father, listen to me," Robert pleaded. "This is all a misunderstanding. Elizabeth is manipulating you." Elizabeth stepped closer to James, her tone steady but charged with emotion. "Manipulation is Robert's specialty. I've spent years trapped in his web, but I won't stand by while he destroys everything this family stands for." At that moment, the door creaked open, and Clara entered, her face pale. Her unexpected appearance drew everyone's attention, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. "Clara," Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through the tension. Perhaps you'd like to explain your role in Robert's plans. Clara froze, visibly shaken. I don't know what you mean. Elizabeth stepped closer, her words deliberate. You've been his accomplice, haven't you? Helping him siphon money, covering his tracks. Clara's gaze dropped, and the silence was deafening. Robert's face contorted with anger. Don't say another word, Clara. But Clara broke under the weight of guilt. I didn't know the full extent of his plans, she stammered. He told me it was temporary, that he'd fix everything once we were settled. The confession sent a wave of shock through the room. James stood abruptly, his towering presence silencing any further protests. You've dishonored this family, Robert. And you, Clara, have no place here. Elizabeth felt a surge of vindication but knew the battle wasn't over. Robert's actions have consequences. I'm prepared to take legal steps to ensure he doesn't get away with this. James turned to her, his expression softening. You've shown great courage, Elizabeth. This family owes you a debt of gratitude. Robert's fury boiled over. You think you've won. This isn't over, Elizabeth. Elizabeth held his gaze, unyielding. Oh, it's over, Robert. You just don't realize it yet. As the meeting concluded, the family dispersed, their faith in Robert shattered. James pulled Elizabeth aside, his voice low. You've proven your loyalty and strength. If there's anything you need, the family will support you. Elizabeth nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and determination. She had reclaimed her voice, but she knew the fight wasn't truly over. Robert wouldn't go down without a fight, and the storm he'd unleashed was far from dissipated. That evening, Elizabeth retreated to her suite, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She stared out at the sprawling city skyline, her reflection in the glass a reminder of how far she'd come. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was taking control. To be continue with the next part. If you enjoyed the story, then hit on the like button, subscribe and comment for part 2.